More censorship? New reporting finds that the Pentagon was involved in a domestic censorship scheme. According to journalist Michael Shellenberger, Slack messages show direct involvement of FBI, Department of Defense, and Department of Homeland Security employees in a mass online censorship scheme, deliberately misrepresented as cybersecurity.
Last week, Public and Racket published the first CTIL files, which revealed the origins of the censorship industrial complex. And now a second whistleblower has come forward with Slack messages, allegedly showing far greater government and military involvement in the Cyber Threat Intelligence League. Joining us now to weigh in is journalist at the Public Substack, Michael Shellenberger. Thanks for coming on, Michael.
Thanks for having me.
So a lot of what's in this, what's called a trove of documents, let's talk to our viewers who haven't had the chance to read the Public Substack yet. What's some of the most shocking censorship you've seen that's been labeled handling disinformation, as they put it?
I think what's really extraordinary, so this is a second whistleblower who was involved with the Cyber Threat Intelligence League, which was created in early 2020 as supposedly as a cybersecurity initiative to help the hospitals. This new whistleblower told us that really it did not add any new cybersecurity help for the people it was supposed to be helping. And really what we saw going on was it being used as a front for engaging in censorship activities, including by U.S. government employees. We had noted last week that a U.S. Defense Department person, someone working in the military, someone named Pablo Brewer, had worked with a UK military intelligence contractor named Sarah J. Terp to create CTIL's anti-disinformation function. The new files show that there was something called the Defense Digital Services, or DDS, which was part of the Pentagon and which actually advertises itself on its website as the Pentagon's secret weapon. And it's basically working on exactly what you'd imagine, attempting to fight disinformation. But in this case, it was turning its weapons against the American people, engaged in censorship activities. We also have one instance where somebody in the CTIL describes trying to go to Facebook to take down information about an anti-COVID lockdowns protest. So we're looking at pretty significant potential violations, both of the First Amendment, freedom of speech, and also the right to assembly, and the direct involvement of people both from the Department of Homeland Security, but also from the Pentagon.
Talk to us a little bit about the impunity with which these leagues and entities behave, right? Because you just talked about how they referred to this as their secret weapon. They know what they're doing, is a secret weapon. These are revelations that you've come upon based on Slack messages, which are not necessarily a super secure way to communicate. So talk to us about, not just from this, but sort of your whole career of talking to whistleblowers and reporting on this censorship industrial complex, how they're able to just continue doing this and get away with it and don't seem to be willing to come to heel at all.
Yeah, they need to be brought to heel by both the Supreme Court and Congress. I think it's pretty clearly illegal. The First Amendment says the government shall not interfere or should not limit our freedom of speech. It should not limit our ability to protest, to assemble. And so I think we're still in early days. The whistleblowers come to us rather than to the government in many cases. They often don't feel comfortable going to the mainstream media, given that the media has been advocating more censorship. So, I think we hope to see action. But yeah, I think to your point, what's so amazing, what we discover here is that these guys create new entities and then shut them down after a year or so. That appears to be a very deliberate strategy to basically hide their activities and throw investigators and journalists off the scent. So you can track the people over time, and that's what we're doing. But the organizations come and go, and so we thought that was mostly just with contractors or with supposedly non-governmental organizations. It now appears to be the case as well with the Defense Digital Services. We did hear back from the Pentagon, and they said, oh, well, that organization combined with two other organizations, and we don't know what was going on. We don't have insight into it, which is absurd. You're dealing with, these are military intelligence organizations. Of course they knew what was going on. But they're now trying to kind of say, we don't really know. Or, look, there needs to be an investigation of this, because clearly what occurred is that in 2016, after the Brexit election and after the Trump election, the military and intelligence agencies of the United States and Britain, and we think the other Five Eyes nations, the other English-speaking nations in the world, that they basically turned their psychological operations, disinformation efforts, and censorship campaigns against the population. And they explicitly were saying, well, we used to be able to control the information because it was before the internet and the rise of social media. We can no longer do that. And so now we have to engage in basically, what's called counter-populism. So they took the tools of counterterrorism and they turned them against their own domestic populations. That is illegal, and it has to be rooted out and stopped and defunded and dismantled. It's particularly sinister because cybersecurity is important. Like, we want to protect our computer networks. They then went and added cognitive security as though it were some extension of cybersecurity. Cognitive security literally means trying to control the information and how we're able to think about things. This is so wildly inappropriate. I kind of am at a loss for words sometimes. I mean, I'm still shocked. I continue to be shocked by it, but I do think that there needs to be a proper investigation. I always point out, look, it should not be viewed as a left-right thing. I don't think if Trump is elected, Democrats should not want the Republican administration to have control over these tools, these censorship tools.
You say it's not a left-right thing. I think that's important because largely the Twitter files haven't really been taken too seriously by members of the left. There's a lot of criticism that, the government censorship was necessary because COVID was a big problem and there was misinformation online and it was for public health. It sounds like what you're saying is now there's even more evidence that the censorship was political in nature in the direction of counter-populism efforts. I think the left should absolutely care about government censorship in any form. The Cold War era wasn't that long ago, but the American memory is very short. Michael, we know this, but can you say more about some of these efforts that were in the direction of quelling populist discontent in the U.S.?
Well, yeah, because I'm old enough. I read Noam Chomsky when I was 17, and this was sort of what Noam Chomsky and the radical left was always talking about, which was the ways in which the U.S. government, NATO, the Five Eyes nations were always trying to thwart populist uprisings around the world. Sometimes they were left-wing populist uprisings, sometimes they were right-wing populist uprisings, but it was basically the regime trying to maintain control over the information people had and how they thought about things. I will say, we are seeing more people on the right now calling for censorship of pro-Palestinian voices. They would say pro-Hamas voices, whatever you would call them. I do think you're now seeing more calls from the right for censorship of left-wing voices. I hope that awakens the left, progressives, to the threat of censorship. I'm not sure it will. It may take a little while. But I think clearly what these files show and what we reported last week, and I think what's also in the Twitter files and the Facebook files and everywhere else, is that this is a reaction from elites, from the top down, a reaction from the establishment against the populist voices. And, so you see when they do get censored, it's often radical left populist voices that are being put down. So this is inappropriate because when we say it's top down, we're talking about governments basically being organized. These responses are coming directly from the military, directly from the intelligence agencies. It should send, chills up the spine when you consider that this was exactly what we didn't want in the United States. We did not want what was allowed to be said to be determined by the king or the government. We created a country that put free speech as the First Amendment because the idea was the freedom of speech comes first. It comes before the government. We use our voice to decide what the government who should be in the government. It should not be people in the government deciding what we can say. Certainly not elected leaders, but also not unelected bureaucrats in the Pentagon who basically spazzed out after the Brexit and Trump elections and decided they need to take it on themselves to wage psychological war against the American people.
Yeah, I think, your point about the First Amendment is obviously well put and well taken. But I wonder, obviously the First Amendment is there, and yet they've still been doing these things that are in violation, it's seemingly quite evidently, of things like that, and probably a number of other federal laws that are on the books. So what kind of oversight would work in order to actually make sure? Because even if, these things that you're exposing now, these people that you're tracking who are moving between these entities that are started up and then shut down right away, even if we're able to, pursue accountability for those people, the government is still the government. There's still going to be the Pentagon, Homeland Security departments, things like that. Is there any way for the American people to really have trust that this is not going to continue happening, even if everything that you're exposing right now is handled?
Definitely, I think the American people should not trust at all the government after what we've seen. I don't. And there's this old saying that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. And it sounds like one of those old cliches that doesn't matter. But boy, it's one that I keep thinking about. I think about it almost every day now, that this is really a life's work. I mean, this has to be done constantly. What I will say that gives me some hope is that when the heads of these agencies are brought before the Congress, both the head of Department of Homeland Security and the FBI, they back down and they say that that these things, that they're no longer talking with the social media companies. That's what they told Congress. They sort of suggested that they had done nothing wrong, when of course it was clear that they had. I know for a fact that many of the key censorship activists within the government, the leaders of the censorship industrial complex, when they've given testimony and when they've given interviews, they've really backed off what they were doing and implied that, oh, well, they thought the government should never have been involved, even though they were actually themselves government contractors and themselves often worked for government agencies. I think that what's important about these new files is it shows that that questioning needs to now extend to the Department of Defense. The Defense Secretary needs to be brought before Congress, asked about what was going on here, and he needs to commit to everybody in front of the American people and others that this kind of thing is not going to happen again, and they're not going to be waging war against the American people. In the latter half of the article from yesterday, we describe that there's still all these military contractors that have as part of their mission doing psychological operations, including against domestic populations. And it's a little tricky because the line between, government public relations or propaganda and basically disinformation efforts is a finer line than I think most of us realize, because we expect the government to lie to us about things like secret weapons programs. The line gets crossed when they're engaging in politics and they're engaging in censoring things like COVID vaccine side effect information or people protesting lockdowns. I think that clearly crosses a line. But it's a little bit trickier when the government is just engaging in propaganda rather than when they're engaging in overt censorship. But I think it's one of these cases where intention matters, and the government has a right to, it should put out its point of view and make the case for all the things it makes the case for, including military actions that many of us think might have been wrong-headed. But I think the line gets drawn when you have these secretive efforts to engage in censorship and what I think they themselves call psychological operations for things like cognitive security. When the words you're using start to sound like things from an Orwell novel, I think that they're probably in violation of the First Amendment.
Yeah, I think you're definitely right on that. And thank you so much, as always, for your incredible work on this, because without your work, we would never know this was happening and there would never be any way to have oversight. Michael Shellenberger, thank you for joining us. We'll have more Rising right after this.